is being recorded. We will stop recording before moving on to the questions and answers period because we welcome and encourage your open and honest communication. Remember, this meeting is also an opportunity for you to provide feedback and questions on this new outreach and engagement strategy and the funding partner process. There are various ways to participate and provide questions and comments today, and we'll talk about that next. We are offering today's meeting in English, as I mentioned, since we did not receive any interpretation requests for Spanish or any other language as part of our efforts to ensure we meet the language needs of the state of California. I'm now going to go over some participation instructions to get us properly grounded for our meeting this afternoon. In the event that you get disconnected from the meeting, please rejoin using your personalized Zoom link. Everyone will have their microphones muted until the question and answer segment begins after the presentation. To speak during our question and answer session, you'll want to raise your virtual hand. This will help us locate you in the attendee list. If you are called upon, you'll be asked to unmute yourself to speak. If technical issues arise, no problem. Please email safer@waterboards.ca.gov. Also the email on the screen, and I will be putting that email in the chat. In your email, indicate the problem you're having and a good phone number to reach you at. You can also ask for assistance in the Zoom chat function at the bottom of your screen by messaging one of our hosts. Okay, here's today's agenda. We will start off with some background information on the Safer Drinking Water Program, followed by an overview of the Safer Outreach and Engagement Plan, focusing on who is involved and how it works. Then we'll go over community prioritization and give an overview of the application process. Finally, we'll move to the questions and answers period of the workshop. As a reminder, we State Water Board staff are here to listen to your comments and your questions, and we'll respond as best as we can. Now, on to the presentation, starting with an overview of the Safer Drinking Water Program. Currently, many Californians do not have access to safe drinking water. The Safe and Affordable Funding for Equity and Resilience Drinking Water Program, known as SAFER or Safer Drinking Water, was established in 2019 after the passage of Senate Bill 200. SAFER is a set of tools, funding sources, regulatory authorities, and engagement strategies designed to ensure Californians who lack safe and affordable drinking water receive it as quickly as possible. The purpose of SAFER is to bring true environmental justice to California by addressing the disproportionate environmental burdens experienced by some communities and advancing justice for people of all incomes, races, and cultures. Now, to give an overview of the SAFER Outreach and Engagement Strategy, I'll pass the mic to Adriana Renteria, Director of the Office of Public Participation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Britta, and good afternoon, everyone. Really excited and happy that y'all are here to join us. I'm having some internet bandwidth issues, so if throughout I need to turn my camera off, that's the reason why. I'll try to keep it on, but you all let me know if I'm cutting out. So to begin, many of you have probably might have heard of the outreach and engagement strategy as we discussed it in our SAFER advisory group meetings. So many of you may have listened into those meetings and seen an earlier version of this strategy. And before we talk about the strategy, we want to begin with why we're proposing this in the first place. The SAFER program, like Britta mentioned, is really unique in that we are really trying to address historic injustices. So one of the unique components of the SAFER program is that rather than waiting for water systems to come to us to apply and solicit resources, SAFER program staff proactively reach out to systems in need to help them get the support that they need. The Safer Drinking Water Program has been in place for 2 years, most of which has taken place during a global pandemic. So during this time, we have really struggled to see a high turnout when it comes to engagement at the local level, at the local drinking water solutions level. This is really a problem because we know that meaningful and active community engagement is necessary in order for water systems to get to a place where they are equitable, resilient, and sustainable. Areas of the state where we have been able to see more success in terms of advancing solutions have been in areas where we are partnering with technical assistance providers like Self-Help Enterprises, Pueblo Unido, Leadership Council, and others who already have deep and existing relationships with communities and are already trusted messengers. So with that, all of that in mind, and taking our lessons learned from our last 2 years, we really wanted to expand the pool of organizations we partner with so that our partnerships can help us work together towards advancing local drinking water solutions. So today, we're going to be talking about 3 types of partners that make up this outreach and engagement strategy. The first is technical assistance providers. The second is funding partners. And the third is a community partner. The focus of this specific workshop is our funding partner. We'll share more information about the other 2 types of partners as well. But today we'll dive a little bit deeper about the application process and the roles and responsibilities specifically for funding partners. All right, and like Britta mentioned, we are gonna have a Q&A at the end, but if there's anything that comes up, you can feel free to put it in the chat and one of us can try to either answer it or we can come back during that Q&A. All right, so we're hoping that by implementing this outreach and engagement strategy, by working with these 3 types of partners, we will be able to increase the level and depth of community engagement in local drinking water projects. We'll be able to keep local drinking water projects on track. We'll be able to identify potential risks, issues, or delays early on in the process. And ultimately, our goal is to build local capacity and create a path towards resilient and equitable water governance. That's the ultimate goal. And we know that in order for us to get to these outcomes, community engagement is a critical component to that. It is a necessary component to really resilient water systems. And over these last 2 years, we have seen the way that historic barriers continue to create challenges that prevent a community from taking an active role in the local drinking water solutions in their community. I want to talk about some of those barriers here. Some of these barriers include historic barriers. So many communities have been impacted by legacies of inequitable government practices, institutional and structural racism, exclusion from decision-making processes, and an overall lack of investment. All of this has led to distrust, fatigue, and oftentimes apathy when new solutions are being proposed. Many communities with unsafe drinking water are also linguistically isolated or are communities of color. And oftentimes the way that government agencies have approached water education has not really presented information in a culturally relevant manner, oftentimes not in the languages that communities speak, or oftentimes not in the platforms that the community receives their information best. Technological barriers can limit a community's ability to get information or even participate in virtual meetings like the one we're having today. And in communities where access to internet, smartphones, or computers is limited, having local water decision-making taking place in a virtual setting could create a really big, significant barrier. Socioeconomic barriers existed for many, many years, but COVID-19 has really heightened and worsened those socioeconomic barriers as it's disproportionately impacted low-income communities and communities of color, many of which have really struggled over these last 2 years to pay their water bills and have struggled with added stress of the pandemic. Community infrastructure have also created different barriers. Often in the communities that lack safe drinking water, they also lack both physical infrastructure and social infrastructure. Lack of physical infrastructure can look like a community not having an actual location to host public meetings, so a physical place to convene. And lack of social infrastructure can look like communities who do not have active or existing community-based organizations. And without those community-based organizations, it's really difficult to do direct outreach and engagement in those areas. Poor communication is a really big barrier when it comes to water. Many of you on the call have worked with water solutions in the past and can recognize that Drinking water solutions can take many years to complete. And when we don't have clear communication about the project progress, this can lead to communities being confused about the speed of the project, uncertain about project milestones, and overall distrusting the project leaders. And lastly, funding for outreach. So we know that in order to address these barriers, in order to implement meaningful outreach and engagement, we need to partner with local groups. But all of that takes time and it takes resources. And we know that if we really want to truly partner with grassroots groups, we need to fund them for their time and for their expertise. And that's one of the main reasons we are trying to implement this outreach and engagement strategy. These are only some of the challenges that we know that exist. And in order for us to really address these barriers, we know that we need to partner with the local experts, the experts who already have a deep understanding of their community's needs, who have those deep relationships and can really help us to advance local drinking water solutions. So here's who we're partnering with. And I want to walk through all three of these. The first I want to talk about is our technical assistance providers. So technical assistance providers are organizations or entities that can provide administrative, technical, operational, legal, managerial, or community engagement support to failing water systems. A technical assistance provider, they can provide one or many of these services. It depends on their specific expertise. There is no limit to the number of technical assistance providers that can join the pool for the SAFER program. And we receive applications on a rolling and ongoing basis. So if an organization or an entity is interested in becoming a technical assistance provider, they will submit a statement of qualifications and let us know which of the menu of services we've listed they have an expertise in and can help offer to the SAFER program. If they meet the eligibility to become a technical assistance provider, then they get added to a pool of SAFER drinking water technical assistance providers. Once they're in that pool of technical assistance providers, SAFER staff will identify communities in need and match them with a technical assistance provider that fulfills the need of that specific community. Technical assistance providers have the ability to subcontract out for specific services. So for example, if a technical assistance provider is providing a water system support in planning for a long-term solution, they may need to subcontract out to an engineering firm to implement a feasibility study or a rate study, right? The technical assistance provider may not have the specific skills to do a rate study or a feasibility study, but they know who to contact and who to work with to help that community fill that need. So through this way, they're able to help communities get to a solution a lot quicker. So that's our first partner, our technical assistance provider. The next partner we want to talk about is our funding partner, and the reason we're here today. So a funding partner is a specific type of technical assistance provider. The main role of a funding partner is to enter into a master funding agreement with the State Water Board to fund our third type of partner, a community partner, who will then do outreach and engagement activities for the SAFER Drinking Water program. The same way that other technical assistance providers can subcontract out for specific needs, like engineering studies or rate studies, funding partners help streamline the funding process for the skill of outreach and engagement. So our third partner is our community partner. So community partners are our partners that implement direct outreach and engagement, community education, and capacity building activities in selected communities. So community partners can be grassroots organizations, school groups, local neighborhood associations, faith-based organizations, nonprofits, or essentially any other group that's interested in supporting drinking water efforts in selected communities. They don't have to be experts in water. They don't need to know or have experience working in water, but they do have to have experience working with that specific selected community. Community partners are selected by SAFER program staff and are assigned based on the selected communities that SAFER program staff identify. A community partner could be assigned to one or multiple communities. So these are the brief overview of our 3 different funding partners. Today, we're going to go into the roles and responsibility of funding partners, but we have other opportunities to learn about technical assistance providers that we'll share about later on in today's presentation too. So now that we know our 3 types of funding, our 3 types of outreach and engagement partners, we want to talk about how this all works together. So number 1, our first step is selecting and identifying funding partners and technical assistance providers. That's our first step. Right now, we are currently soliciting applications for a funding partner. We're gonna receive applications until March 31st. And we'll talk about the application process later today. For technical assistance providers, like I mentioned, there's no deadline. So we will accept applications to be a technical assistance provider on a rolling and ongoing basis. So if you're interested, and if your organization is interested in applying, we encourage you to do so. So that's where we are right now, identifying and selecting funding partners and technical assistance providers. Our next step is really identifying which communities we want to select for enhanced outreach and engagement. What I want to clarify here is that this specific outreach and engagement strategy isn't going to replace the existing work that's taking place. So if, for example, there is currently a water system that's already on track towards a solution, that's going to remain. If there's already work taking place in different communities, nothing is going to change there. But what we're talking about here is how can we utilize the skill of outreach and engagement to accelerate solutions in specific communities that could benefit from enhanced level of engagement? That's what we're talking about when we say identifying select communities. So SAFER staff will identify a select number of communities, and these communities will receive targeted assistance through community partners or through technical assistance providers. For this first round, we're going to be selecting a group of communities to do this solicitation. In future years, we will identify selected communities as needs arise. So towards the end of this year, the SAFER program will release a list of those selected communities. And once we have that list of selected communities, we will solicit applications from our third partner, our community partners. So for specific communities, we're looking for community partners that have existing relationships in those communities. They will apply, and we will select community partners based on those relationships and skills. After soliciting applications from community partners and selecting community partners, our funding partner will work with SAFER staff to prepare community partners to begin their work. So that would include executing their funding agreement and making sure that all of our agreements are in place. After our funding agreements are in place, that's when we're going to begin training and onboarding. So like I mentioned earlier, community partners do not have to have experience working with water. So this training and onboarding piece is a really important component of strategy. That means we're interested in working with people and organizations who maybe have never worked on water, but are interested in supporting their local community get safe water. So for each community, there's for all community partners and technical assistance providers, they will go through a training and onboarding process. Once they're assigned to their specific community, the next step would be for the project team, which includes the community partner, technical assistance provider, and SAFER staff, to come together to meet to talk about a kickoff meeting for that specific community. At that project kickoff meeting, they will discuss the community's drinking water challenges and begin working together to develop an engagement approach. After they've developed an engagement approach, then comes the implementation. So the community partner and the technical assistance provider will work together to implement their outreach and engagement strategy. Over the course of this implementation, we will have regular touch points where we're able to check in on progress and deliverables and make sure that the community partners and technical assistance providers are getting the resources and the support that they need. And finally, down the line, when the community has received safe drinking water, we'll close out this project. We will reflect on project highlights and then share some of those highlights with the public as well. So that's a snapshot of how our process will work. Now I want to talk about how communities will be prioritized for enhanced outreach and engagement. And again, this strategy that we're proposing here will not stop any existing work that's currently being done. We are just working to identify a select number of communities that could benefit from enhanced engagement. So some of the criteria that we are considering to identify communities is the following. If the water board's mandates a consolidation in a community, they would be prioritized for enhanced engagement. When the water board appoints an administrator to assume some or all temporarily assume all or some responsibilities of that water system, they will receive enhanced engagement. In two areas where a regionalization effort could be implemented, and in an area that either has high numbers of domestic wells, multiple small water systems, multiple water systems that are currently failing to provide safe water, systems that currently serve disadvantaged communities or Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, or select water systems that exceed maximum contaminant levels, have been out of compliance for over 3 years, have a high vulnerability score from our Callan Viral Screen tool, are small and serve less than 1,000 connections, and serve disadvantaged communities or Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. This is some of the criteria that we're considering as we look through the number of potential communities to prioritize. And like I mentioned, later on in this year, we will release that list of selected communities and begin the solicitation of community partners for those specific communities. So with that wraps up our overview of our proposed strategy, the different components and how we're aiming to identify selected communities for enhanced engagement. Now we want to talk a little bit more specifically about the role of a funding partner. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic back to Britta, who's going to talk through some of those roles and responsibilities and how to apply.
Thank you, Adriana. I will now cover some sample responsibilities, desired qualifications, give an overview of the application process, discuss what happens after selection, and go over a timeline for this process before we move into the questions and answers segment of the workshop. As a reminder, funding partners coordinate with and fund community partners' outreach and engagement activities. They receive their funding from 3-year master funding agreements with the State Water Board. These master funding agreements are part of the State Water Board's technical assistance funding, so funding partners are required to meet the eligibility guidelines for technical assistance providers, which is described in Appendix C of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund Policy. That link I will share later. Funding partners are considered a specific type of technical assistance provider. Some sample responsibilities include, but are not limited to, entering into a funding agreement with the State Water Board, monitoring budget and submitting quarterly reports to SAFER staff, managing subcontracts for community partners, liaising between SAFER staff and community partners, monitoring and coordinating community partner progress and deliverables, maintaining regular communication, relationships, and support for community partners, and alerting water board staff of concerns or drinking water issues. Since this is a process that we're currently developing and we anticipate we'll have some adjustments as we go along, these are just sample responsibilities. So there might be more later and they will be tailored for specific communities. Moving into qualifications, essential skills for funding partners are experience managing and tracking a large number of subcontracts, the ability to liaise between local grassroots organizations and government agencies, and being able to work with community partners to track and report on metrics and progress. I will now pass it to Jasmine Oaxaca from the Division of Financial Assistance, who's going to discuss the application process.
Thank you, Britta. Hi, everyone. Jasmine Oaxaca from our Division of Financial Assistance. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as mentioned previously, entities interested in becoming funding partners will apply through our Drinking Water Technical Assistance Provider Request for Qualifications process. And more details on those requirements can be found in the guidelines included on our Technical Assistance Funding Program website, also included as Appendix C of the policy. And the process steps are as follows. We recommend that you review the RFQ guidelines, develop a statement of qualifications or SOQ, and select the community engagement category. Make sure to describe your experience subcontracting and managing grants as part of the discussion. Then you would submit the SOQ to this email provided on the slide, and also indicate outreach funding partner SOQ in the email subject line. As mentioned previously, these funding partner SOQs will be due by March 31st. And then following submittal, State Water Board staff will be reviewing and evaluating applicants based on criteria that are included in the RFQ guidelines, and we will be responding to applicants within 45 days of receipt of their SOQ. And then should applicants be deemed qualified, they will be placed in the qualified pool. And then after that, we would work with them towards a funding agreement to conduct the specific work. Again, this is once communities are identified and community partners are identified as well. And so I will turn it back over to Britta, who will discuss more about timeline.
Thanks, Jasmine, for overviewing that process for everyone. Now we can move into some timelines. So here are the steps following selection of a funding partner. Funding partner and SAFER staff will prepare and execute a funding agreement. SAFER staff will solicit community partner applications for priority communities. Community partners will be selected for those specific communities that we identify. SAFER staff will then meet with outreach partners to discuss the community needs. The funding partners and the community partners together will develop a work plan. SAFER staff will review and approve the work plan. Funding partners will begin funding the community partners' outreach and engagement activities. And then community partners will be onboarded and implement their work plans. So these are the steps after selection of a funding partner, but what does the timeline for this all look like? Here's our anticipated timeline for the SAFER Outreach and Engagement Strategy launch. Here you are all today on March 9th for the funding partner workshop. And after this, on March 23rd, the State Water Board is holding a workshop for prospective technical assistance providers, where we will go over some of those qualifications and application process. The funding partner solicitation window opened on March 1st, and it will close on March 31st. We will then select funding partners mid-2022, and in late 2022, funding partners' funding agreements will be finalized. Once we are in early 2023, we anticipate soliciting applications for community partners for those identified communities. We will then select, onboard, and fund those community partners. From there, outreach and engagement partners as a whole will plan and implement activities. Now that we have moved through the outreach and engagement strategy, funding partner responsibilities, and application information, next steps, and a timeline, we will move into the questions and answers segment of the workshop. Before we open the floor to questions, I would like to quickly review some participation instructions so that we can have a meaningful discussion. To provide a comment or question, for those of you participating on Zoom using your tablet, computer, or smartphone, raise your hand or type your question to the chat function. To use the chat function, you'll scroll over to the bottom of your screen until a taskbar appears, and then you can click the chat speech bubble icon. From there, you can type in your question or comment and click send. Either send it to the whole group or make sure that it's going to one of the hosts, depending on your comfort level. Another option is to raise your hand. To do that, scroll over to the bottom of your screen until a taskbar appears, and then you can click on the raise hand icon. It looks like we don't have anyone calling into this meeting, so I'm going to go ahead and skip over those instructions for call-ins. However, I will be calling on folks in the order which I receive questions or the order which hands are raised first. When I call on you, please feel free to unmute, state your name and organization if you feel comfortable, and ask your question. Circling back to a question that was asked at the beginning of this meeting about recording, I would just like to clarify that since it has been requested that we record the question and answer portion of this meeting, we will now be recording this segment of the meeting rather than stopping the recording as the presentation ended. If you don't feel comfortable being recorded, I would suggest that you send in your comment via chat and let me know that you want it to be anonymous. I'm going to go ahead and look to the chat first to see if there's any questions there. Okay, so I have a question that says, when would the 3-year funding agreement start and end for the funding partners? So for this question, I'm going to see if Adriana is able to take it, and then we can tap in for Jasmine as well.
Yeah, I also want to invite Jasmine to come on. So like Britta mentioned, we're hoping to select funding partners at the beginning or mid-2022, so around April. And then the actual execution of a master funding agreement can take a few months. So I'm going to pass the mic to Jasmine to tell us a little bit about that time estimate.
Thanks, Britta and Adriana. That's correct. It would take a couple months for us to negotiate with you on, your specific scope and budget. And then we have a whole internal process that agreements go through. So the timeline would be on the order of months, once a funding partner was selected up through an executed funding agreement. However, I do want to note that the way our approvals work, our deputy director is able to commit funding kind of earlier on in the process, which he would be able to start. However, you would not be able to request reimbursement for those executed. So there could potentially be a short time on the order of months where you would either have to float some costs until you're able to be reimbursed. Some of our applicants also choose to not do that at all and just wait until their funding agreement is executed to avoid any risk associated with that.
Thank you, Jasmine. And then in terms of when to anticipate, going back to our timeline, we would select funding partners, begin that process, and we hope to have that funding agreement executed by the end of 2022. So the solicitation of community partners and the identification, we anticipate that would take place early 2023, just in terms of timing.
Thanks, Adriana, for that clarification, and Jasmine for providing some more details about what that looks like in real time. I want to see if Natalie has a follow-up question or if that answered the question that you chatted me. Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, I want to see if anyone else has any questions. Feel free to either raise your hand, send them in the group chat, or send them to me directly. Okay, another question has come in. The question says, is there a budget recommendation or time commitment suggestion for this work? This is a great question, and thank you for this question. To answer this question about if there's a budget recommendation or suggested time commitment for this work, I'm going to pass it to Adriana first and then pass it to Jasmine for further clarification.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think part of the budget depends on the number of selected communities, because a big part of what a funding partner would do is subcontract out to those selected communities. Right now, we know that for this first round, we will be identifying about 15 communities for this first round. So over the next 3 years, you can anticipate if we identify 15 communities at most for 3 years, that's the number of subcontracts that would be included as part of this agreement. So part of what Jasmine was talking about with that negotiation of the funding agreement, that's when we would talk through how much it would take for your organization to manage the subcontracts for those number of subcontracts. So that's how you can sort of anticipate the budgeting aspect of it. So for this first round, a maximum of 15 communities and over the course of 3 years. And Jasmine, if you want to chime in and share a little bit about how that's determined, that would be helpful too.
Sure. So once we get more serious about the kind of specifics, we would share a budget template with you with different cost category types where you could kind of break down your costs and try to figure it out that way. But as far as kind of a funding cap, we don't have one currently.
Thanks, Adriana and Jasmine. I want to check in with the requester of this question and see, oh, here we go. How many funding partners are we bringing on? She asks. For this question, I'm going to pass it to Adriana.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you've noticed that we have intentionally left that open. So if we receive an application for a funding partner that is able to provide service and cover the entire state, that's an option that we're looking into. The other thing I want to keep in mind is that if we receive multiple applicants, we want to find other opportunities for them to also work in the SAFER program. So as a reminder, a funding partner is only one type of technical assistance provider. So if an organization is not selected to be a funding partner, they may be selected to join the technical assistance provider pool to provide additional resources. So either way, we're encouraging everyone to apply to be a technical assistance provider and take a look at those different categories in that application. So if you're not selected for the specific funding partner role, you may fit a great role to provide other services to other communities too. So to clarify, potentially one funding partner, depending on the applicants that we receive.
Thank you, Adriana, for that response. I'm now checking the chat to see if there are any more questions. And I want to thank everyone for these questions so far. I'm sure these are things that everyone's thinking, even if you're too nervous to ask it yourself. So this is really beneficial for everyone just to ask these questions that are on your mind. Because if you're thinking it, I'm sure other people are thinking it as well. It looks like there isn't a follow-up to that question. So I once again want to open it up to everyone. You can feel free to put your question in the chat. You can direct message me or send it in the group, or feel free to raise your hand using the reactions button. Okay, while we're waiting for folks to ask some questions, maybe just to get their mind jogged, I want to hop to questions that we thought that you might ask. That way we can maybe address some of those just right off the bat. So I'm just going to ask a general question, and then Adriana, feel free to answer since we already were anticipating these. So a question that some of you might be asking is, are funding partners going to select their communities?
Thank you, Britta. So no, funding partners are not, part of their role and responsibility isn't the selection of community partners. So to clarify, Safer Water Board staff is going to use the criteria that we talked about earlier today to identify a list of up to 15 selected communities. Once we have those 15 selected communities, we will share those communities out with the public and begin soliciting applications for community partners for those selected communities. So Safer staff will be part of that selection process. That being said, we do value the expertise and the guidance of funding partners. So once funding partners are once the funding partner is brought on and is working with the Safer program, we'll likely share our applicants and have a discussion with them about it. But their role won't be the selection of the community partners.
Thanks, Adriana, for that answer. While you were answering that question, it looks like we did get another question in on the chat. So we did get a question that says, can a funding partner also be a community partner? So for this one, Adriana, I'm going to pass it to you, who can give some clarification on funding partners being TA providers as well, and whether they can also be a community partner.
The short answer is no. The short answer is that we are really looking for a funding partner to play the specific role of managing subcontracts to fund community partners. So that being said, I really want to encourage you, if your organization is interested in partnering with the Safer program, to apply anyway. And we will receive applications. And if your organization or your group is not a good fit for the funding partner, we'll see if there's other opportunities. You may be a better fit for a different technical assistance provider or a community partner.
Thanks for providing that answer, Adriana. I want to pass it back to the person who asked that question and see if you have a follow-up or see if that clarified it for you.
That clarified the question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for asking it. I have another question that's come in via the chat. This one says, why aren't funding partners included by name in Appendix C, which is the TA provider request for qualifications? To answer this question, I'm going to pass it to Adriana first to give some insight, and then see if Jasmine has anything to add to the conversation.
Funding partners are a specific type of funding partner. A specific type of technical assistance provider. They are not listed in the guidelines because the outreach and engagement strategy was developed after the guidelines were adopted by our board. And maybe Jasmine can come on to talk a little bit about how those guidelines are developed and why those different categories were created.
Yeah, thanks, Adriana. So on the more general technical assistance provider side, this was really spurred on by recent legislation that passed over the fall, which allowed technical assistance provider quotes to be an eligible entity for direct funding from the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. So as such, at the time that we proposed our fund expenditure plan for adoption, we also updated our policy to mention that, and also state that we would develop more specific guidelines for that request for qualifications process for drinking water technical assistance providers. So we did we did do that back in December. And so that is available now for any interested entities. And let me just bring up real quick the different categories. Sorry, I had it here. So there's 6 service categories that we're looking at: administrative, technical, operational, legal, managerial, and community engagement. And then, so as Adriana mentioned, with the development of the outreach and engagement strategy, we tied that back into our technical assistance provider guidelines. And so essentially a funding partner is a specialized type of TA provider. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thanks, Jasmine and Adriana, for those answers. We have another question that came in that says, will there be travel required? And is a specific organization location preferable? So when we're looking at potential funding partners, is there a specific location of the orgs where they're located, where they're headquartered, that we prefer or that is preferable to this job position? And additionally, as being a funding partner, are funding partners required to travel in any way? To answer this question, I'm going to hop it to Adriana, who can provide some insight about locational preferences and potential travel or not traveling.
Mm-hmm. Right now, we are still conducting the majority of our work online, virtual, and we can continue. We will be able to continue that as well moving forward. For our funding partner, there is no specific location that's tied to this role, right? If we're identifying one funding partner, we would identify somebody an organization that's able to develop subcontracts to organizations across the state. So long as your organization has the infrastructure to do so, you would be a great funding partner. A clarification is community partners. Community partners are required and expected to be based out of the selected community that they are applying to work with. So they do have a location specific requirement, and we do expect them to be able to meet in person and to do direct outreach and engagement in person as well. The funding partner, not as much. We may have at some point in the process a meeting to convene all of our funding partners in person to do maybe a training or to do some kind of reflection, but we're early on in the planning and can be flexible depending on outcomes of our pandemic and public health and safety.
Thanks, Adriana, for that clarification. I wanted to see if there was a follow-up from that person. And it sounded like someone maybe came off on mute. If you have a question and you're unmuted, you can feel free to ask it. It looks like there's no follow-up to that question. Okay. I really want to encourage folks to send your valuable questions in the chat. Not only are those helpful for other people to hear, but I think it also informs how we create our guidelines and what sort of information we're putting out, since these questions can help us identify where there's gaps in knowledge or anything like that. So I really appreciate all the questions that have been asked so far, and I'd like to encourage you to keep asking them.
Absolutely. And then as we're waiting, I'm curious to hear from the folks who are on this call. Today, the purpose was really to talk about funding partners, but I can imagine that many of you, after hearing the overview and the different types of partners, you may be drawn to consider applying to be a technical assistance provider or to consider applying to be a community partner. And so I'm curious to hear from the people who are on the call. If you can add in the chat, just your thoughts. Are you considering applying to be a funding partner? Are you considering to be a technical assistance provider or community partner? If you could just let us know in the chat, it'd be great to know where you are.
Okay, some comments are starting to come in. I will not be reading out who's saying them for confidentiality purposes, but it looks like someone is saying that they're considering being a funding partner. Someone else says that their organization is considering being a funding partner. So we have 2 so far, and this is really helpful feedback for us. So I thank those of you who have let us know so far. Someone said they need some community organizing in their county. Someone said experience as a funding partner for another grant, but they could also be interested in being a TA provider. Someone else said considering submitting an application for technical assistance provider.
That's really great. We are so excited to hear that y'all are interested. It really takes everyone in the state to work together to advance safe drinking water, and we're really excited that we have that opportunity to partner together. And if you think of questions as you're working through this application and you want to meet with us before you submit, we're open to do so as well, and to talk through your application and what to include or what not to include as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Adriana. We did receive another response. They just wanted to learn more about the process. So I want to thank everyone for putting these sort of like interest areas in the chat. And I want to encourage you to keep doing so. I did want to open it up one last time to see if there are any more questions. And then I wanted to echo what Adriana said. And if more questions come up, feel free to email us. We would love to help you answer your questions or clarify things about the application process or selection process. I will be going over some resources in a few slides where you will get our contact info and things so that you can stay in contact with us in this process. So I want to open it one last time and see if there are any more questions. Okay. So in terms of next steps and closing, I wanted to thank everyone for your participation in the questions and answers session. I will now remind you of some upcoming important dates and share some resources. As a friendly reminder, we are having a workshop for potential TA or technical assistance providers on March 23rd, 2022, that will cover the steps and requirements to submit a proposal to provide technical assistance to small, disadvantaged communities to help them meet their drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and groundwater needs. And the solicitation window for funding partners will remain open until the end of the month, so March 31st. And this, the application period for technical assistance providers is ongoing, as has been mentioned. For additional information, we invite you to visit the following websites, which I will be putting into the chat. Oh, and I did get another question in the chat. I don't want to let that go unanswered. So someone asked if the partners need to be a 501c3, which a 501c3 is a certified nonprofit. So to answer this question, I will pass it back to Adriana.
Thank you. This is a question actually for Jasmine related to eligibility for technical assistance providers.
Yeah, thank you. So based on our funding source, which would be the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund, any nonprofit would indeed have to be a 501c3 to be eligible. Good question.
Yes, and I wanted to clarify too, so to be a funding partner, you do have to be a 501c3, as Jasmine mentioned, but to be a community partner, you would not have to be a 501c3. And as Adriana gave some examples during the presentation, those could be faith-based organizations, community groups, schools, etc. So if you don't meet that qualification to be a funding partner, I would consider whether being a community partner is a better fit for you. And I want to thank that person for their question. That was a great question. Moving back to resources, I have put some of these in the chat. So there's a link to the Safer Drinking Water Program website. There's a link to the Division of Financial Assistance website, the Office of Public Participation website. And then if you wanted to read the outreach and engagement strategy itself, which goes over not just funding partners, but also community partners, technical assistance providers, and goes over some of these barriers and the foundation as to why we created this strategy. I would encourage you all to review that. I put the link to the English and the Spanish version in the chat as well. And additionally, questions or requests for more information can be sent to the SAFER email, which is also in the chat. Someone else asked the same or a very similar question, asking if 501c, oh, actually it's different. 501c12s are eligible for becoming a funding partner. So 501c12, I'm going to pass it back to Jasmine for this, since this is a funding partner and technical assistance provider eligibility question.
So if you were trying to get funding as a nonprofit, you would have to be a 501c3.
Thank you. I do appreciate these questions as they are coming in. And once again, I'd like to recommend that if there are more questions, feel free to email those to us, or just keep on putting them in the chat. I appreciate those coming in, and they're very valuable questions. Going back to some of the resources, these are all in the chat. And if you have any questions or requests for more information, feel free to contact us at our email. That's safer@waterboards.ca.gov. As we conclude this workshop, I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for your attention and participation. I appreciate the questions you have asked today and giving us some insight as to what brought you here today. If more questions pop up for you after this workshop, feel free to send us an email at safer@waterboards.ca.gov. And thank you all for joining us today.